Buongiorno a tutti, grazie per essere venuti così numerosi.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being so numerous to this meeting. A meeting during which we shall try to focus on the main topic of our festival dedicated to unequal health, focusing on obesity. Unequal health is a very interesting topic because it puts together different competencies and different situations. So health has been brought to the Festival of Economics. We have Lawrence COIA here, a physician who also teaches at the Pennsylvania University, and an economist, Dr. Kiersten Stromboten, who, after obtaining her PhD in Yale in health policy and management, is now working at the American Institute of Research in Washington, D.C. I am a physician. I have a university degree in medicine, but have always been working as a journalist. And never in my life would I have thought to come to a festival of economics, especially on this side of the desk. Anyway, this is a sign of our time. We have finally understood that to tackle complex problems, that we have to get together, to unite our forces, to merge our competencies so that we can approach problems from different viewpoints. I invite you all to come at 6 o'clock at Teatro Sociale to listen to Michael Marmot, who back in 2004 gave the following definition: status syndrome. This means that there is a syndrome which is related to the social status, to the economic status. It is obviously clear that if you're very poor, you do not enjoy such a good health as those who can actually be taken care of and cured in the best possible way. However, the issue is much more complex and less direct than we could think. Obesity in particular is a theme where we can actually take many aspects into consideration: genetics, personal behavior or lifestyle. This is what we're going to focus on today, because obesity certainly partially depends on how much and what we eat. But it also depends on environmental factors. I like to quote the following example. I live in Milan, and recently the Porta Nuova area in Milan has been refurbished and restructured with the beautiful Garibaldi Square and many beautiful cycle paths. So today, instead of taking the car or the underground, we like to walk, to cycle. My child goes to school by bicycle. Well, these decisions have a significant impact on health. And as far as obesity is concerned, we tend to say that the larger your flat, the smaller your size. Well, this actually reflects our culture and our situation. Obesity is more frequent in the lower social classes and economic classes compared to the higher ones, where more attention is paid to what you eat. People do more exercise, they go to the gym. Totally upsetting a historical relationship, because in the past, people who had access to more food actually were fatter, and this coincided with the higher social economic classes. Conversely, people starved and died of deprivation. So things have changed completely, and what can we do to reduce the disequality, the social economic disequality that has such a strong impact on health as well? Well, I would like to ask our Kiersten Stromboten to give us her presentation that will try to explain exactly this.
Buongiorno.
Good morning.
I hope I'll speak slow enough that the translator can keep up with me. Just to give you some background, I'm a health economist. I do research on the economics of obesity, specifically obesity policy, so thinking about the ways that we can address the consequences of the way we eat. And what I want to do today is kind of frame our panel discussion more broadly and think about, first, what do economists even have to say about our health and our eating habits? And I think we have much to contribute towards both measuring the economic consequences of what we eat and understanding the economic and market factors that contribute to obesity. Ultimately, our health, and I always approach it from the obesity perspective, but health more broadly, is the result of a series of dynamic decisions about our health behaviors, which is kind of the perfect topic for economists to dig into. And I think it provides a really important and useful framework for thinking about the appropriate role for government intervention. So as I move through this talk, I kind of want to have a few questions in our heads, some big picture questions. And the first is there a rationale for government intervention? Right? We can answer this question or try to answer it from a neoclassical perspective, so from the traditional kind of Chicago school of thought. Second is, should the government save people from themselves? So beyond the neoclassical arguments for intervention, what's the appropriate role for government in this instant? And then how? What's the most appropriate and effective way to do this? So let me start off the talk by showing you, these are the top 10 leading causes of death in the US, and I'll show you the Italian version of these rankings as well, but the spoiler alert is that they're quite similar. And what you'll notice from these top 10 causes of mortality is that they're directly related to health behaviors: heart disease, lung disease, diabetes. Going beyond this, most of them can be correlated or show positive associations with our diet or what we eat. This is the same for Italy. These are the top 10 leading causes of mortality in your country. Again, directly related to health behaviors, per se, and many correlated with diet. So I'll talk about the evidence in a second for what that means to be correlated with diet. But when we talk about the ways in which what we eat and being obese is associated with our health and the health consequences of being obese, it really affects the entire body. I mean, from heart disease, associations with cancer, gout, diabetes, arthritis, pretty much everything has a link to being obese and ultimately what we eat. So I like to ground our talk in a kind of thinking about the magnitude of this problem. So the arrow points to Italy. You guys actually have got relatively good obesity rates for adults in your country. About 1 in 10 Italian adults are obese. That's compared to 1 in 6 for the OECD average, and 1 in 3 for the American population. So this panel talk is ultimately about whether what we eat is to blame for our health and what impact it has on longevity. And Professor Steckler couldn't make it, so I'm going to try and take on a little bit of his talk and just kind of give you a flavor of why that question is so difficult to answer. So is there a link between diet and health? The short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, but there's very little consensus beyond that simple statement. Nutrition, at least in my country, talking about nutrition is a little bit like talking about religion. You know, everyone has their beliefs about what's healthy. We come with our priors, and part of that is because we all feel like experts. We all eat every single day, multiple times a day, and if I have a glass of wine and I feel great, I'm ready to tell my family and my friends that they should also have a glass of wine and convert them to my ways and ignore all other research. And this is kind of one of the big pitfalls of science, and this is any science, not just nutrition or economics, is that once you think you understand something, you kind of ignore all hypotheses to the contrary. And when we talk about nutrition research specifically, it's inherently difficult. Just the nature of it is very, very difficult. That's because our gold standard for looking for evidence, randomized controlled trials, are really difficult to do in human beings. It's because they're expensive. They're expensive to do in the long term, which is when we might expect to see outcomes in our health related to our diet. And humans are fallible. Larry can tell you, it's very difficult to get humans to adhere to any particular set of diets. You can maybe do it for a week and people will stick to a low fat or a low carb, but after a couple of weeks they start to trend back to where they started out. So even when you can pay for the randomized controlled trial, it's very difficult to get people to adhere to it. So in the absence of randomized controlled trials, what do we do for nutrition research? Well, we rely on observational studies, which are also oftentimes flawed, not by any fault of the researcher, but by lack of data. They tend to be, many of them tend to be correlational. So I don't know if you were at the introductory section to the conference yesterday, but there was a comment about parents who read to children also find that their children have better health, so we should all read to our children. And while that's a very, that's a great idea, it's not necessarily implied from the research study that it's a causal relationship. So you'll see this all the time if you read a magazine or a newspaper, a really sexy headline about, coffee. So people who drink coffee live longer. So drink coffee, you'll live longer. And that data usually comes from a study where we look at individuals who drink coffee and we look at how long they live, and we see they live longer, and we make an assumption. Drinking coffee makes you live longer. But actually, what could be going on is that people who drink coffee are more educated, they're academics, they're writers, they're doctors, they make a lot of money, and what could really be driving longevity is the high education and the income that gives you access to more resources. So it's not the coffee per se that's causing the outcome, it's all of these other unobserved factors. So this is a very broad problem when we do nutrition research. In addition, it's usually based on self-reported measures. So we call up people and we say, how many glasses of wine, or how much sugar did you have last week? And we ask people to tell us, and we'll get some kind of estimate. Maybe they're too embarrassed to tell us the truth. Maybe they don't remember. But ultimately, those are the measures that we're using to make inferences about health. So this is not great for nutrition research in general, but it can actually be quite dangerous when we go to make policy recommendations from non-causal or flawed estimates. So this is a graph of the 7-country study by Ansel Keys. It was done in 1953. And what it shows is a relationship, a positive relationship between saturated fat intake and your health, mortality. And what happened was we kind of ran with that in the US, and we thought nutritionists got very excited about this research, and they said, oh, fat must be bad for you, and this whole industry around proving that fat was bad for you developed. But actually, this is really all about how you cut the data. So this is a study that was done a few years later by Yerushalmi and Hilbo, where they expanded 22 countries, and you can see that the relationship is much less striking. So the danger in doing this kind of research and then making policy recommendations off of it is if we're wrong, it could have big implications for our health. This is a picture of the food guide pyramid, which was a US recommendation from the 1990s. And you can see they said limit your fats. You should eat the least amount of fats at the top of the pyramid there, and eat the most amount of carbs and starches and rice and grains. Well, if we're wrong about fat being bad for you, which many people who eat a Mediterranean diet would tell you, like, of course you should eat fat, then we could actually be harming the population. So nutrition research is flawed. We do the best we can with the data and the resources that we have. And all of this is pretty horrible from a public health perspective. But what should be the role of government and policymakers here? Right? I come from the US, where our countrymen have a weaker stomach for government intervention than perhaps elsewhere. So I want to approach this question from an economic perspective, which means we want to think about markets and market failures. So the ways in which our world may not be operating as nicely as it does in our economic models. So traditionally, when we talk about market failures, we think of them in 4 flavors. So we think about externalities, the classic example being if I smoke and I produce secondhand smoke that harms your health, that's a negative externality and represents kind of a traditional justification for the government to intervene over our behaviors. Market power is a little less difficult to justify in the context of obesity. This would imply, monopolies over foodstuffs and rising prices, but in fact, we see the opposite issue. We see falling food prices and falling food prices for items that are not incredibly healthy. Public goods is also a little bit difficult to justify in the realm of eating and food. And maybe we could think about asymmetric information. So this is the idea that companies or producers of the food have some information about the health of the food that the customers aren't privy to, which opens up the policy options of informational campaigns and labeling. Right? So one externality, and I don't know if we want to call it an externality in the classic sense, but one justification for intervention is that it's very expensive. Obesity and all of the comorbidities translate to very high medical expenditures. In the U.S. case, I love that graphic. The U.S. case, we're looking at $147 billion a year, and that's a conservative estimate. They go upwards depending on the study. About half of this is borne by the public, by the taxpayer, in the form of our public health insurance programs. The other half is represented in kind of what economists would call opportunity costs. So this would be what we say absenteeism or presenteeism, which means that individuals who weigh more are more likely to miss days of work and also less likely to be productive or as productive on the job. So those are kind of the traditional ways that economists might think about why we would intervene in a market. But there's another assumption we make about free markets, right, which is that consumers are rational, right, and that we choose to be obese or that we choose to be overweight. Well, is that true? I mean, how does this story change if we believe that there are addictive components to what we consume? Certainly, Larry would argue that for many individuals, alcohol is an incredibly addictive substance. So to what extent do we want to think about helping people help themselves? Right? A lot of that really depends on your view of addiction. Right? The traditional view in economics is that we're all, rational actors. We solve these kind of constrained maximization problems in our head as we walk around the world. But the problem with that is we never actually observe each other's maximization problems or utility functions. And so we make assumptions that people behave in their own best interests, right? And there's a number of theories, I won't get into the specifics, about how we might make mistakes with respect to our consumption decisions, right? And all of this really matters. This framing issue of who's to blame matters for creating support for public interventions. This is a cartoon that kind of shows two different ways of looking at the world, right? On the left, the conservative or right-wing view is like, I have a problem. This is my fault. This is my choice. And on the liberal or the kind of progressive view is, the country has a problem. So this represents a big challenge to effective policy, right? Framing matters, which explains the efforts by many public health advocates to prove the addictiveness of sugar or to frame the public as victims of the food environment, to kind of search for a villain. This is a graphic that shows kind of mixed public support for these kind of policies in the U.S. There was a policy in New York City several years ago where the mayor banned the selling of large sodas, and it was kind of universal backlash from all parties against this policy. This is a sign on the back of a bus in New York City, but don't let them tell you what size to buy. Second challenge is that there's very little consensus on what's healthy, as we've talked about. And finally, when we talk about regulating our eating behaviors, we draw many of our lessons from our experience with other substances that we consider risky. So tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. There's many important differences between these substances, right? These represent single substances that are easy to regulate and easy to target. There's very few substitutes for these substances, and they're generally acknowledged as addictive with clear health risks. So when we talk about food and how to regulate food, what do we even mean? What are we regulating? Are we going to target sugar? Are we going to target soda? Are we going to target fat? Total calories? I mean, there's really very little consensus over what it is that makes us unhealthy. And there are huge diet wars to this extent. If you go to the bookstore table in the plaza that they've set up for the conference, there's a section where they're selling diet books. And you can just look at the diet books and see that they're totally different. One recommends vegan, one recommends a Mediterranean diet, one says low-cal, one says you need an ancestral paleo, Atkins diet. And what are you going to make of that if even the researchers don't know what's healthy for you? How do we think about regulating food? Right? And then the final problem, or the final challenge with effective obesity policy is that the evidence on the effectiveness of any single policy is really dismal. It turns out really the only thing that's effective in the long term at reducing weight at an individual level is bariatric surgery or gastric bypass. And that's a very costly, risky intervention. Okay, so where does that leave us? Right? Where do we go from there? What are some promising interventions? And I'm really going to skim over this. I'll give a talk on Sunday and we'll talk more specifically about policies. But if our concern is purely monetary, right, as economists, we're concerned only about the financial burden to society of our obesity-related expenditures, then we want to look at strategies that are cost savings. And that's a really high bar for publicly funded prevention programs. To date, there's no compelling evidence that obesity prevention programs save money. That's not to say that there may not be a good reason to implement them, just that cost savings may not be it. The most effective or efficient strategy to recover the external costs of obesity would be to experience rate publicly funded health insurance programs. And what I mean by that is charging individuals a differential for what they pay for insurance based on their health status. And your willingness to stomach or to agree with that kind of policy really depends on how you feel about whether or not you believe that people make rational decisions to eat and choose to be obese. And then finally, in the absence of experience rating, governments are increasingly considering targeted sin taxes as a means to recoup their costs. So these could be sugar-sweetened beverage or soda taxes. There was a fat tax. I want to say Belgium or Germany. And even around these taxes, there's very little consensus on what's appropriate or, again, what that targeted food item should be. There's also very little evidence that they actually change consumer purchasing patterns, let alone translate into clinically meaningful outcomes. We could think about, as a host of programs, informational campaigns, right? So if we believe this is a problem of asymmetric information, maybe what we want to do is try to educate the public about what they're eating. That could be through menu labeling, putting nutrition labels on products, educating children in schools, public service announcements. This is everyone's favorite strategy because it imposes very little cost on everyone, but people who don't want to see the information don't have to. The other problem is that they just don't generally work. Or I shouldn't say that. We don't see the effectiveness of any single informational campaign in any particular study. I'm going to skip over this for now. So what do we need? We're clearly not there yet on the nutrition science. We need estimates of the relative importance of different behaviors, so understanding whether it's calories, whether it's eating, whether it's exercising, and what type of calorie. We need evidence-based theories of behavior, so understanding the extent to which addiction plays a role in our health outcomes. And then, of course, we need effective interventions. And I think developing effective intervention really depends on getting the first two bullet points right. Thank you very much.
Great, Kiersten. Thank you very much for this overview. Penso che sia meglio se volete.
Maybe we can take some questions now. Yeah, thank you for your talk. I have a couple of questions, but let's start with this one. You said that there are no policies that are cost savings, but I would say that most of our policies in any single healthcare sector are not cost saving. So maybe if we set the bar about being cost effective, then maybe we can say, yes, we can promote these policies. If we set the bar of being cost saving, then yes, so I just wanted to specify it. Yeah? Okay.
Any other no, don't you want to say something?
No, you're exactly right. So if we're trying to recoup costs, we want to look at cost savings, right? So that would be the justification, and that's a really high bar, as I mentioned, because they're just not there across any health behaviors. So cost effective is the next best thing.
Qualche altra domanda, commento? A me ha molto colpito di questa presentazione una cosa.
I was greatly impressed by your presentation. There's always the interdisciplinary approach that we should pursue, and I believe that individual choices, individual behaviors, and the guidance that can be given by governments on individual behaviors should also be somewhat constrained. So to what extent individual choices may be impacted by different factors, not only knowledge, because if I'm overweight, for example, I know perfectly well what I should eat and what I shouldn't eat, but there are other factors that are at play, as is true with other health problems. So I was wondering if getting to know things and getting to know things also about emotional or framework situations may have an impact. As far as obesity goes, for example, as with other health issues, but in the case of obesity, I believe that there is a stigma that goes with it. That is perhaps, obesity is perhaps the condition that is accompanied by greatest stigma. So guilt appeal, making people feel guilty because they are obese or because they have wrong eating behaviors. I don't know whether this can actually be of help. I don't know whether communication-wise that this kind of approach can be good or not. I don't know whether there are any evidences on it.
Sorry, I thought you were the translation. I was wondering if the guilt appeal in communication about obesity, I mean, to make people feel guilty for their behaviors, is there any evidence about this, about the effectiveness of this approach or not?
So I think we see this kind of the blame game with any kind of risky health behavior. We saw it with tobacco too. There's always this kind of tension between who's to blame, right? When in the case of smoking cigarettes, you could make the case that we all have free will and that we all can choose to smoke or not smoke. But then there's kind of an entire side of advocacy that seeks to kind of put the blame on the tobacco industry and say, you know what you're doing and you're making us obese and we're kind of victims of this situation. And lung cancer. And that same tension exists when we talk about obesity and health-related outcomes with respect to eating, and that you have an entire camp who says, if you're fat, it's because you're eating too much, and shame on you, and control yourself, and I'm fine, why can't you be fine? And then we see the other side emerging as well, which is, the system sets us up for failure. If you walk into the pharmacy, you have to walk through kind of an explosion of candy to even purchase the products that are supposed to make you healthy. If you drink a soda, you have to drink 5 more because it's addictive. And again, how you frame that really matters for engendering the public support for any particular policy that really goes beyond that kind of neoclassical regulation.
Okay, thank you very much. So now abbiamo parlato del cosa mangiamo.
So we've been talking about our diet and the impact that the diet has on our health. But we understand that at times we also in contradictions, because, for example, young teenagers sometimes they never eat during the weekend, and over the weekend they drink a lot. So the relationship with alcohol is also key. This is something that we should consider as well. Studies that got published over the past few years showed that there's no minimum dose that is totally risk-free. So when we look at mortality rates, also when we look at the onset of cancer, we know that alcohol has a role to play, but we know that our lives are risky. We know that whatever choice we make is risky. So when we sit at the table, we have to weigh risks and benefits. When we drive our car, we do likewise. And also when we drink alcohol, there are aspects that have to do with staying together and, some little pleasure that goes with having a nice lifestyle. So there's all these things that are to be considered. This is going to be the subject of Professor COIA's presentation. He's an expert on such a subject, and he's going to present us the positive aspect of a balanced and healthy behavior when it comes to wine, especially, again, with a special focus on wine if compared to other alcoholic drinks.
In Trento, one of the ways I learn a bit of Italian is by watching Italian television, and one of the programs is Un Passo dal Sole. Un Passo dal Cielo. So now I'm pretty close to being one step from heaven. This is a great city you have here. My topic is wine and health, and I'm going to have it in two parts. So I'll stop in the middle for questions at that point, if it's okay, Roberto. So, and I want to thank Tito Burri for inviting me here. That wine can be beneficial to mankind is not a new concept. It's been known to the ancients as being both healthful and actually have healing properties. Here we're going to examine the value of wine as part of our diet, basically, but also as part of a healthy lifestyle. Let's push down here. This is one of the key slides I wanted to indicate. One of the misconceptions about wine is that it's often linked to alcohol, to tobacco consumption. And the mortality from alcohol versus cigarette smoking is very, very different. As you can see in these two graphs, do we have a pointer? But the graph on the left obviously shows the risk of all-cause mortality as related to the number of cigarettes per day. And one can see that even at the lowest levels of cigarette consumption of 1 per day, the risk of 1.5 of all-cause mortality is much higher than 7 drinks per day. Now, I have to define, a drink is generally in the range of 14 to 15 grams of alcohol. So with wine, that's approximately 120 cc glass of wine, or in the U.S., 4-ounce glass of wine. On the right, you can see the fact that... Pardon? On the right, you can see the fact that the effects of alcohol are twofold. And as I could paraphrase Paracelsus, a 16th century Swiss physician, any substance has poison in it. It's all a matter of the dose. And here you could see that at low levels, alcohol can actually be beneficial with a 20% reduction in overall mortality at 1 drink per day. It rises back to a level of 1, a relative risk of 1 at 3 to 4 or even 5 drinks a day, depending on the model that's being used. And even at 7 drinks a day, in no way approaches the effects of smoking cigarettes. So tying alcohol consumption or linking alcohol and tobacco is an incorrect, is a misconception that I think we have, particularly in the United States, where the sale of alcohol is governed by an agency called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I'm very happy that Kiersten was able to point out that the literature that we have on diet and wine consumption is not based on large randomized trials, but rather on large observational trials, usually retrospective trials. So here, I also want to point out that when one smokes cigarettes at 1 pack per day, which some would consider light, but it's actually, the relative risk is 3 times that of non-smokers, whereas a heavy drinker, it's, again, only about 1.2 or 20% higher relative risk. So this is a very, very important slide. That type of a curve that you see for alcohol consumption, where there's actually a benefit to low levels of alcohol consumption, and the risk for higher levels of alcohol consumption. Oh, thank you. So this is where the benefit is. This is called a J-shaped curve, and the high risk here for the higher levels of consumption have been reproduced. This was a meta-analysis of over 1 million participants in over 36 studies. And one of the other misconceptions that has led to the demonization of alcohol, at least in the United States, is the temperance movement, which actually started not long after the American Revolution. And at that time, there was a problem in the United States, mostly with heavy spirit drinking. And the temperance movement was started to moderate alcohol consumption. But that moderation over the next century became one of not just moderation, but the need for total abstinence and a real demonization of alcohol. This is a print, a Currier and Ives print from 1919, which depicts people who are interested in having beer, wine, whiskey, etc., entering a saloon and going on the road to ruin. So in 1919, enacted in 1920, was the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibited the sale of alcohol. And that lasted until 1933. To borrow a term from Alvin Roth, this was a repugnant market for many, but it really was not that repugnant, because the black market that existed, because so many people wanted to drink alcohol, actually led to a lot of problems subsequently, with a big use of criminal sales in the black market, and that criminality persisted even after the alcohol sales were over, because they moved into other industries. Oops. So I've already mentioned in that second slide the importance of moderation. 1 or 2 drinks of alcohol has beneficial effects. But you can't average 1 or 2 drinks per day over a week and say, well, I'm going to drink all my 7 drinks on Saturday. You cannot binge drink. There are several studies that show that light to moderate drinkers who occasionally drink heavily have significantly higher mortality than those who do not drink heavily. Whoops. Now, why is alcohol important, or how is alcohol reducing mortality? It's mostly through a reduction in cardiovascular risk. And you saw in Kiersten's slide how important cardiovascular risk in the United States and in other countries. It's one of the leading causes of death. Well, the risk of fatal and non-fatal cardiovascular events are reduced by nearly 30% with moderate alcohol consumption. Mainly MI, or myocardial infarction, and stroke are reduced. Even as far as cardiovascular disease, fatal ventricular arrhythmias, that would be sudden death, is decreased with 1 drink per day. But binge drinking, on the other hand, generally defined as 4 to 6 drinks on at least one occasion per month or more frequently, is associated with an increased risk of non-fatal atrial arrhythmias. How does the alcohol affect the cardiovascular system? And what I say for alcohol, I'm using, because there is more research on alcohol than on wine. There are larger studies, but I will give you some other evidence that this applies to wine. In fact, if anything, wine has probably more beneficial effects than just alcohol in general. Alcohol and some of the polyphenols in wine can increase high-density lipoprotein. That's the good cholesterol. It can improve flow and clotting properties of blood. It decreases platelet adherence, decreases production of fibrinogen. It promotes fibrinolysis, lowers stress and inflammation. If you look at certain markers in the bloodstream for inflammation, they are significantly lower with moderate alcohol consumption. Relaxes blood vessels so that even patients with hypertension who drink moderately can see some reduction in blood pressure over time. I found this interesting, that studies with over 400,000 patients suggest that moderate alcohol consumption can reduce the incidence of type 2 diabetes, and that those with type 2 diabetes can benefit modestly, but can benefit from low levels of alcohol consumption. Interesting study, a nurses' health study in the United States with over 12,000 participants indicated that there's a significant risk reduction in mental abilities with age, so that nurses who were 73 years old were performing on mental ability tests as if they were 71 years old. So a couple-year improvement in mental abilities with moderate to light drinking of alcohol. Also, reduced risk for dementia and Alzheimer's has been more recently shown in large meta-analyses. It also can have benefits like inhibiting production of gallstones and kidney stones. But this is what we are faced with as physicians, and population understand that alcohol use can be very harmful to health. But in general, we're talking about heavy alcohol consumption. I can tell you that in the United States, every bottle of wine or alcohol has to have 3 statements on it from the U.S. Surgeon General. The first is that alcohol can cause intoxication, and it is a major contributor to automobile accidents. Alcohol can cause birth defects, infect a fetus and cause birth defects, so it's not recommended for pregnant women to have it. And the Surgeon General also says that it may be harmful to your health. It says nothing about being beneficial. So all these things are on our labels in the United States with alcohol consumption. We know it can cause problems with the liver, hepatic dysfunction, with cirrhosis and interference with metabolism. My specialty was radiation oncology, so I treated many cancers of different types, and I'm quite familiar with those that can be caused by alcohol consumption at heavy levels, particularly those of the upper aerodigestive tract and liver. That would be the oral cavity, the oropharynx, hypopharynx, larynx. Now, there has been a recent study, or meta-analysis, I should say, that addresses more moderate consumption and its increase in the risk of breast cancer of approximately 7%, 5% in premenopausals, 9% in postmenopausal women. And I could talk about that more if the audience wishes later. Other significant effects, although low levels might in fact help the hypertensive patient, it is linked to hypertension at more than 3 or equal to 3 drinks per day. As I mentioned earlier, it can cause atrial arrhythmias at more than 6 drinks a day, will double the risk. The risk for hemorrhagic stroke increases. The hemorrhagic stroke is about 15% of all strokes but that is significant. Immune suppression can be induced. So the patients who are immune suppressed or receiving chemotherapy generally have to drink alcohol in very, very moderate amounts. And of course it can cause pancreatitis, gastritis, duodenitis, or inflammation of many structures. Now, to switch the topic more specifically to wine, this study that was reported from Denmark in 1995, so over 20 years ago, was one of the first to suggest that alcohol is not the same. So beer is not the same as wine, which is not the same as spirits in terms of health risks. And here the study, which was large, over 13,000 people, studied for a long period of time, was controlled for exercise, social standing, education, and income level, showed a 60% lower risk of heart attack, 50% risk of overall mortality than abstinence. The equivalent amount of beer, at least in this study, had no impact on mortality, and the equivalent amount of spirits increased mortality 20%. Now, this study was criticized because it was found that there were some confounding factors that weren't controlled for. As Kiersten said, there are other factors that need to be, and many of the patients who preferred wine also preferred a more healthy diet in terms of more fruits and vegetables, etc. However, a recent meta-analysis did indicate that, and I think it included over 100,000 people in the various studies, did indicate this J-shaped curve that you saw for alcohol in general specifically applies to wine and to beer, but could not be reproduced for spirits. And I might have some reasons for that later on if we wanted to go into it. So how much of alcohol is consumed as wine versus others? Well, it really depends on where you're at. It's only 8% of alcohol consumption worldwide. It's much more in Europe at 25%. In fact, in Italy, it's 2/3 of the alcohol consumed is wine. And in the Americas, it's about 12%. In the U.S., in particular, it's 17%. I'm going to close this first part and open to questions, if it's okay with Roberta, to say, I'm probably in the wrong place to talk about wine and health, because I think the Italians already appreciate the value of a Mediterranean diet and adding wine to that diet. It was recently ranked as #1 in the world by the Bloomberg Healthiest Country Index, and second in the world in the healthcare systems by the World Health Organization. So, congratulazioni e i miei migliori auguri che si continui a guidare il mondo in salute. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Larry, for your Italian too. Sappiate che ha studiato solo un mese l'italiano, eppure è bravissimo.
Larry has studied English only for 1 month, that's his accent.
Okay. Allora, se avete qualche domanda, poi lui ha altre...
So if you have questions, you can ask them now, then there is a second part of the presentation, but so we can be interactive.
In italiano e in inglese?
In English or in Italian?
Okay.
In Italian.
Okay. Otherwise, I'll help you.
Yes, I have a question. When you talk about wine, do you mean white or red wine?
No, it's nothing to laugh at.
In the next part of my talk, I'll look at the red wine versus white wine. In general, the studies in vivo, in people, don't show a significant difference. But the laboratory studies would suggest that the antioxidant activity, the amount of polyphenols in red wine is 6 to 12 times higher in red wine than white. And the potential for decrease in cardiovascular risk through the factors that I mentioned earlier, decreasing high-density lipoprotein, et cetera, are much, much better for red wine than for white. But again, we don't have supports in humans to say that's absolutely the case. As Kiersten said earlier, there's a big gap between, what we think is right in theory and in the lab and what is really happening in humans because of all the other factors.
Come ha spiegato prima Kiersten, sono studi veramente difficili da condurre.
So, as Kirsten explained to us before, it is very difficult to carry out this kind of studies, and it is easy to confound an occasional relationship or correlation with a cause-effect link. I do not know whether we are the healthiest country in the world thanks to wine. I'm a bit doubtful about that.
Col microfono così è meglio.
In Italy today, young people have taken on the bad habit of drinking wine and long drinks where you have some alcohol and sugary liquids, and they keep drinking that because they do not perceive the alcohol content. I think this can be very dangerous. This is a good point, and it actually connects the two presentations. Did you hear the presentation?
Did you understand?
Yes, I understood, and I think it is a real problem. In fact, if you look at the consumption of wine in Italy, it has been decreasing over the last few decades, and as a person pointed out, many of are changing to spirits and drinks which are higher in sugar, and these are not beneficial to health as wine can be. So I think Italians must remember, if they're going to continue a guidare il mondo in salute, to drink wine in moderation and not substitute it with sugary, high spirit drinks.
Anche perché Kirsten, penso che
Because I believe that sugar, the sugar intake through drinks, with or without alcohol, doesn't give you the idea that you are eating sugars. I mean, if you eat a big cake, you know that you're having something sweet with sugar. But drinking something, you do not perceive that. Is that right?
And if you think about... Is that working? Yeah. If you think about the ways that you would get sugar in nature, it usually comes packed with fiber. So if you think about fruit, which is very sweet, the sweetest fruits, so you could think about sugar cane in its purest form, you'd have to gnaw through wood to get to that sugar. That's pure fiber. And it kind of is this nice correlation between sugar and the amount of peel that you have to get through. So apples, which aren't as sweet, don't have as much fiber. Watermelons, which are very sweet, you have to get that fiber. So when you eat it in a more natural form, it usually comes with compounds that help protect your body. The other thing I'll mention is that obesity rates in the Middle East are actually quite high. And one of the hypotheses for that, those rising rates, are that in those countries they don't drink alcohol, and so the form of socialization is to drink a lot of soda or drink a lot of fruit juice, and so you're getting a lot of pure sugar that's spiking insulin. The insulin storing those calories in the blood. Sugar is fat, and it's a perfect storm.
Okay, would you like to go on with your presentation?
It's up to you.
O qualche altra domanda?
Any other questions?
Possiamo poi anche
We can also continue with the questions afterward.
And keep in mind, when I speak about recommendations, I am a physician, but I'm not your doctor, and I think it's fundamental to everyone to know that they need to take control of their lives themselves, and that's why you're here, to learn what's best. I've already mentioned what is in a drink of alcohol. It's about the term one drink has been formalized, but not 100% throughout all countries, but it's generally 4 or 5 ounces. A dry wine would have 0.5% sugar or less, generally 11 to 14% alcohol, and about 100 to 120 calories. Doesn't have much in the way of other nutrients. There's a little vitamins B and C and some elements, but what it does has, as was brought out earlier, are the polyphenols. Resveratrol is a still bean. There are anthocyanins that color the wine, particularly red, and so they're much greater in red wine than white. But beer also has polyphenols, just a bit less, and that might be one of the reasons that it takes a little bit more beer to reach the nadir and go back to a relative risk of 1 because you need more of those polyphenols than are available in 1 liter or a half a liter of beer. So does wine have something special that other alcoholic beverages does not? It's probably the polyphenols in addition to the alcohol. These substances are found in fresh fruits and vegetables, but are in a greater concentration in red wine. And, you know, one of the things that contributes to our aging and problems are free radical formation, oxidation. As a radiation oncologist, I caused that by radiation. Unfortunately, it killed the tumor more than aging the other tissue. But these free radicals that are formed by cigarette smoking or stress or inflammation can be harmful to the health. And having an antioxidant, which would then take those electrons from the free radicals and bind them, that's what antioxidant activity is, can be helpful to health. And you find a lot of it in tea and apples, beer, apple juice. But in general, as I said earlier, it is higher in red wine than others. But this is just part of what I think is a healthy lifestyle. It's not just drinking wine or controlling weight. It's exercising regularly. I suggest when I have patients, I'm retired now, but that each person should work up a sweat at least a couple times a week. That usually means that they've burnt enough calories. Obviously, don't smoke cigarettes. I hope you saw in that second slide how detrimental even 1 to 4 cigarettes is. Try to reduce stress, relax, control weight. The Italians have been very good at that, but it sounds like the younger generation might be having some problems. And have the healthy diet, which includes wine with meals. I have Il Piatto del Mangiar Sano. I'm not really going to go into that in detail. These things do change, but this is one of the present recommendations, actually from Harvard. But you see, they also have a little thing here that says muoviti, and so it's not just the diet, exercise. And another one from Harvard, the first dietary pyramid that I saw that actually included wine is this one from Harvard, and it's a healthy eating pyramid, and it says optional, alcohol in moderation, not for everyone. One of the things that's stated, and I should mention some of the best literature, if you want to read more about consumption of wine in moderation, read the literature from Italy, from your Food and Nutrition Center, and from there's a study, there's a Cattolica Università in Campobasso that's doing some great research. So I think the Italians are leading the world in some of the wine in moderation research. That's where I got a lot of my information anyway. So now, this is not my recommendation. I just wanted to show you, this is Anstey's rule in 1870, recognizing that the standard recommendation is 1 to 3 drinks maximum per day and can be varied on the individual. Hypertension, 2 or less a day. Diabetes, dry wine at 1 a day. Females, 1 drink a day. Liver problems, consult your doctor. Heavy drinkers, cut back to 1 or 2 a day or abstain. So those were my concluding slides. I don't really have any more. Some people ask me, well, you know, if you promote low levels of alcohol, some people are going to become alcoholics. And alcoholism, obviously, is a big problem, and binge drinking is as well. I could not find the data to suggest how many people who are alcoholic drink wine only. It wasn't available for me. So I just did a rough estimate of rates of alcoholism actually are quite high in the U.S. compared to Italy. 0.5% in Italy, almost 5% in the United States. Wine consumers, though, in Italy is 2/3 of the population, as I mentioned earlier. So this is not correct, but it may give you an estimate that maybe a 1/3% would be alcoholic wine consumers, just to get an idea of if you're going to recommend something, you know, what are the long-term detrimental effects and the economic effects of it. Thank you.
Grazie Larry. Penso che questa diapositiva si correlli
Thank you, Larry.
a un fattore culturale.
I think that it has to do with culture as well, because wine is usually consumed in moderate doses, whereas alcoholic drinks are usually drank in binge drinking or in large quantities anyway, because exaggerating with alcoholic drink is kind of easier. More questions?
Because I'm in Italy, but this, in the 1990s, the fact that the French could eat diets high in fat and yet had very low risk of cardiovascular disease was called the French paradox. Why could this happen? And part of the thing that we're saying is...
Can you push the... Okay.
Okay.
Can you start again?
Okay. I'll just repeat that again. I didn't use the term French here because I'm in Italy, but in the 1990s, there was a revelation that the French could eat diets which were high in fat, but yet had a very low risk of cardiovascular disease. And why was that? And this was termed as the French paradox. But in fact, over the years, one can see that the French diet of high in fats is also cheese, and some of those fats are bound. They consume it rather leisurely with a meal and not in a high alcohol drink. So these are other factors that need to be considered.
Signora, voleva fare una domanda?
Io vorrei chiedere per cortesia,
I have a question. We know of a correlation, the correlation existing between 2 drinks a day and drugs. I believe that after 50, when you turn 50, you would start taking pills, drugs. So what is the effect of the combined intake of pharmaceutical products and wine?
First, physicians are told, do not tell your patients who are abstaining to drink alcohol for health reasons. And I can understand that because of potential becoming alcoholic, etc. But another reason is many times they can't drink alcohol because it does change the efficacy of some of the drugs that they might be taking. And one has to be very careful about that. On the other hand, there is no more effective drug than alcohol in reducing cardiovascular mortality. If you were to choose one single drug, it would be alcohol. I've got another physician who disagrees, but that's fine. That's fine.
We all can do some cherry picking in evidence. Tutti andiamo a cercarci le notizie che ci...
Well, we tend always to present the studies, the trials that we like best, so we can find all kind of information. So I'm glad to learn that a glass of Prosecco doesn't hurt me, but I believe that we should all refer to our physicians for specific recommendations considering the drugs that we are on. More questions from the floor? Reference was made to the optimal dosage of 2 cups a day. Is this exactly the same for women, or isn't the half for women?
Where there's a benefit, does have its nadir for both men and women at about 1 drink per day, but for men, there's still less likely to do harm if you go to 2 drinks per day. However, if women were to drink 2 drinks per day, that would be more harmful. The reasons for that are not known. There's 2 speculations. One is that the alcohol dehydrogenase in women is generally lower than men, so the alcohol stays around longer. The other is that women have a higher percentage of body fat, and alcohol binds to the body fat and can stay around longer. So these are 2 potential explanations, but yes, there are differences in metabolism and difference in recommendations for the men and women.
Another point is the size of glasses. Un altro punto è la misura dei bicchieri, perché
Well, this morning I was reading Scafata, who's a top expert in Italy on alcohol, stating that over the years glasses have are becoming ever larger. So when we say 1 glass a day, we should consider half glass a day, 125 ml. So we shouldn't actually fill up a glass stating that this is just 1 drink, because usually a glass which is completely filled is perhaps 2 glasses.
5 cc's.
Okay.
Allora, un'altra piccola curiosità. Nella prima slide
In the first slide, you showed us that if you smoke over a pack a day, you have a reduction in death rate with women with over a pack.
Death, but for the
No, the question is, I was surprised as well, because in the graph, mortality seems to decline.
I did see. I saw that. Yes, when you're smoking 1 pack of cigarettes a day, there was some decline in. Was it for women or men?
For women, but I think it was a mistake. I don't think so.
I don't know the reason for that.
No, I don't think so.
It was still too high.
Qualche altra domanda?
More questions?
Io sono curiosa invece sull'uso di solfiti, conservanti.
Now, a question on the use of preservatives for wine, sulfites and others.
Problem with sulfites. At high, again, it's as Paracelsus. It's all every substance has its poison. It's all a matter of dose. At high levels, it could be harmful. At low levels, it might not do anything, or it might even be helpful. I don't know if Kiersten, you have any comments about sulfites in diet? I can tell you that organic growers can use sulfites in their winemaking process. Now, I don't know if they could if there's a special label in Italy that doesn't allow sulfites for organic growers or not, but in the U.S. they can use sulfites.
Forse qui che, diciamo, nella terra del vino qualcuno è più aggiornato, io non saprei dire.
I wouldn't know. Maybe somebody is more learned than I am. Do we have more questions? Maybe a question for Kiersten on the role of policies, of governmental policies in tackling the problems connected with child obesity. Very interesting initiatives have been launched by Michelle Obama to tackle the problem of children obesity in the US. Did it lead to any change, or a lot of advertising and propaganda perhaps? No effect?
So Michelle Obama had a lot of initiatives around getting children to move more, so physical activity. And I think one thing that a lot of people will agree on is that when we think about the relative importance of nutrition and physical activity for weight loss and for health, nutrition plays a bigger role than physical activity does. I mean, people will tell you it's 80-20. And my personal belief is that she focused on physical activity because it was politically easier. You know, there's a lot of food lobbies and a lot of vested interests in the U.S. from the beverage associations, from the sugar lobbyists, from a variety of food companies, and you know, policy initiatives around changing what children eat in schools are very controversial, and so physical activity was kind of an easy target, but not necessarily the area in which we'd expect to see a lot of change.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other comment or questions? Beh, io direi che allora possiamo chiudere. Ringraziamo i nostri.
Well, I think we can call it a day. Would like to thank our guests and like to thank also all of you for staying with us. Thank you.